Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the GoDaddy Pro Meetup. We are here with Kara, and she is going to be covering a bunch of security information. This is our third week talking about security, I believe, but we're doing a whole series throughout the month of February all on security, and I'm really excited to have you here, Kara. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, thank you. And thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here. So the topic, of course, is when to implement security, and I'll just go ahead and hop right in here. For me, I've been working in tech for a little over 9 years at this point. The last little over 2 years, I have worked in this website security services malware remediation team. And I was an analyst for about 1.5 years, and then got promoted about 7 months ago to be a supervisor. So now I manage that team. But at this point, I've had quite a bit of experience of looking at malware, understanding it to a certain extent, seeing what it does, seeing what it looks like, having just kind of an idea of how some of it works and some ways of preventing it. And then, of course, if anybody wants to reach out to me or talk to me about some of this stuff, you can always reach me on Twitter. There's my handle. So here's the question everybody wants to know. When should you implement security? Quite frankly, the obvious and most important answer is now. Absolutely right now. As soon as possible, if you can't do it right now. And a lot of people just simply tend to do it after there's always a breach. So what I'm going to get into here is about how to make a plan, what that plan should entail. And since we're on the topic of when, we're going to look at it from an angle of time. How much time does some of this stuff take? And things that you need to consider when making your plan. So now, or as soon as possible, or after a breach, these are the times when people tend to implement security and or should implement security. So when you're making a plan, you need to think about what needs to be done. The couple things that need to be done are things like updating passwords. Passwords are very important. You need to make sure that you have very strong passwords. Another thing that needs to be done is updates. Software updates are so very important. In fact, two of the main vectors that malicious actors get in are through weak passwords and outdated software on your site. And then another thing that needs to be done is a backup. You need to take backups of your site. Make sure that you have an understanding, make sure that you have a copy of your website just somewhere, preferably a recent one, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So for this plan, consider a lot of things. How long will all of this take? And the time for all of it, there's really no exact time, but it depends a lot. It can depend on, for example, the size of your site. It can depend on how many plugins, how many themes you have, how many users you have on the site. And also, especially since we're dealing with people, how much time does it take to reach everyone? You have to consider getting in contact with everyone that has to do with the site. If it's a client, you have to get in contact with them, everyone that's involved. And who needs to know that their passwords are changing? So consider that. Is it a client that needs to know? Is it just you and you have the power, you have absolute power and ability and agreement with your client? Everything's fine. Go ahead and do what you need to, change passwords, update, just let us know, whatever, all that good stuff. Or does the client need to know that an update needs to happen to their password? Do you have to get in contact with them? Do they want to change the password themselves? They have other people that are at the site that want to change their own passwords. All these things need to be taken into consideration. So now we're talking about who, but also how long does it generally take to get in contact with some of these people? Sometimes people respond very quickly and readily and everything's fine. Sometimes people take days to respond to your inquiries. These things need to be taken into account. As well, maybe they respond quickly, maybe they don't, but who knows? Life things happen all the time. These things need to be taken into account. Time. Other things that need to be done, backups, they need to be taken. So how much time is that going to take? It can take a lot of time. It can take very little time. But again, does somebody need to be notified that a backup needs to be taken? Can you just do it yourself? All these things need to be taken into account. As well, updates. Updates can be very touchy, and we'll get into them a little bit later, but think about what updates need to be done. Who needs to be contacted about these updates? Who does the updates? Is there somebody in specific that does them? Does somebody need to be notified if the website might be going down because there's a website, excuse me, because there is an update? These things all take time. And this is all for stuff in general, but let's get a little bit more specific. So what happens if there's, excuse me, not if, when there's a breach? Because if you're online, quite frankly, at some point, you're going to get hacked in some capacity. It's just the nature of the beast. So after a breach, forensics. If you need to know, if you are in a position where you absolutely have to know, how did somebody get in? How did this happen to my website? Then you need to figure out time into this. Time is very important because, quite frankly, when it comes to security, time is always of the essence. So you need to understand how much time and how much money is this going to take. You need to find a reputable company that's going to be able to go in and figure out how this happened. Where did the breach occur? You need to then give that company time to be able to go in and do this. You need to be able to figure out, if they need to take your site down, how much time is that going to take? Then after they take their time to do this, then they need to hand you back the information, and then you need to process that information. How much time is that going to take? And also, after a breach, regardless of whether or not you need to go in and have forensics done on it, restores can take very little time, depending on how bad the damage is. They can take a lot of time, depending on how bad the damage is. So we're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into some of these topics here. So we're going to go ahead and get into passwords, because we're now talking about how much time things are going to take. So passwords. Now assuming just from start to finish of logging in to your site, going to the users section and just updating the password probably isn't going to take much more than about 2 minutes. But again, things to consider. Admin users in particular. How many do you have? How many admin users are on your site? How many of them do you need to get in contact with to change their password? Do all of them want to change their password themselves? Do you have the capacity to just say, hey, I changed your password, here's what it is, please keep this for you? What are the options here? How much time is it going to take? So, of course, if you need to track the person down, depending on who it is, it could in fact stop site production if they have you do it for them, because maybe they can't get in suddenly and they didn't realize you're going to do it and they missed your email or missed your text or anything like that. How much time does it take to get in contact with their admin users? Not just admin users though. How about your site contributors? If you have site contributors and they have a certain level of privileged access to their user, how much time is it going to take to get in contact with them? Are they going to allow you to change your password for them, excuse me? All these things need to be taken into account as you're updating password security. Now, from a security perspective, I'd like to add an addendum to this, something to check that is also going to be very helpful. A couple things to check, excuse me. First thing you want to make sure you check on your site just every so often is, what is the default role for a user? And the reason I ask this is because what this default role is it sets it up so if any user at all is created on the website, what is the default role for them? How much privileged access are they given by default to your website? There are a number of times that I've seen on websites that I myself have cleaned. I've gone in, I've taken a look at the default user role, and it's administrator. So that means if there's some malicious actor out there that creates a user, suddenly by default, they have administrative privileges to your site. Check that. Update it to the appropriate level. Sometimes this is customer, sometimes this is subscriber. Just make sure you know what the default role is, why it's there, and make sure to give people by default as little access as possible. This access can always be bumped up. Another thing to check for is admin users. Make sure that you're aware of what are the admin users on your site. Are they old admin users? Maybe you hired an SEO company that needed to have admin access to the website. Well, you've long since terminated the contract with them, whatever, but the admin user is still there. That admin user there is a potential security vulnerability. So get rid of it as soon as possible. Just do a quick review on them. We'll get into reviewing software a little bit later, but just do a quick review on your admin users. Who's there? Do they need to be gone? If so, get them out of there. And then, of course, outside of the site itself, there's the web hosting provider account. You need to take into account, are there FTP user accounts that need to be updated for their passwords? Do you have a web hosting control panel, something like a cPanel or Plesk, for example? These types of hosting control panels have a separate login screens that you can get into just simply through the browser. You don't even have to go all the way through the web hosting provider account. You can just pull up a browser tab, log straight into it. That, however, has an admin user whose password needs to be changed. As well, since this is WordPress, it has a MySQL database. So there is a password that is there for that. So you want to make sure that if you're going to change that, that gets updated. Now, keep in mind, if someone has access to this password, which is why you want to change it, if they have access to the password, they can wreak havoc on the site. And sometimes you even have to entirely replace the database because all of the content is gone or corrupted. So, but if you do update this password, which is not a bad idea, just to simply update occasionally, make sure you update your WP config file. wp-config.php is the name of the file, because if you don't, it will take down the site. But again, also, something that needs to be considered. Who do you need to talk to that needs to understand, hey, I might be taking down the site for a very short period of time. You know, does it need to be arranged? Okay, the site can go down for 30 seconds while I update the password and then update in the WP config. You know, does it have to happen overnight? Can it happen during the day? These kinds of things need to be taken into account. And also, again, for changing all of these passwords, it needs to be taken into account who needs to be contacted, and can it just be done? How long is it going to take? Take all of this information into account when making your plan. And we'll go ahead and move on to updates at this point. So for updates, quite frankly, they are extremely important. I would dare say that they are just as important, if not more important, than updating passwords on a regular basis. And here's why. From a security perspective, these updates often correct security problems in the coding. So I'll give a couple of examples here, and we'll just start with one. Recently, and this is one that I myself as well as my team dealt with, there was a plugin that was WP File Manager. For those of you that don't know what this what this plugin does, it's a file manager. So effectively, it allows you to upload and download files just directly from within the WP admin. You don't have to have a separate FTP user. You don't have to get into the web hosting panel, anything like that. You can just do it from WP admin. And so, for example, if you needed to like upload a new theme, restore a theme, anything like that, you could just do it straight through here. So very useful. However, there was an exploit that was found that allowed for remote code execution. Very bad. Now it was released. An update was released that fixed this. However, on several of on the number of sites that I worked on, we would often get repeat sites because they didn't update the plugin. We would always notify them, hey, make sure that this plugin is updated. It's very important. But if they didn't do the update, they would get reinfected extremely quickly. Suddenly they have to go through the whole process of waiting for their ticket to get taken care of, so my team could get it taken care of. And when these exploits are found, especially on a plugin that was as fairly ubiquitous as WP File Manager, there are a lot of people that are getting infected all at once. So make sure you're doing those updates. Now, I understand from a development perspective, this can actually be a pain. Updates can be a big pain for people because there's a lot of different things that can go wrong. And also from a simple perspective of from development, a change in the interface. Sometimes the plugin or theme author is just like, we're just going to change this up. So suddenly now you need to relearn how to use the plugin or relearn the theme. Additionally, updates can accidentally break a site. There are so many themes and so many plugins out there that authors it is unreasonable to expect that a plugin or theme author would have been able to test it against all of the themes and plugins that exist. Or anything like that. So it's important to take that into account, that if the theme or plugin that you're updating breaks the site, then you're going to have to go back through and restore the site. So things like that you need to take care of and watch out for. As well, if you're doing updates, of course, you want to take backups. And we'll get into backups a little later, but again, backups take time. Depends on the size of site, the number of plugins, the number of themes that you have. And we're about to get into all that. So WordPress updates themselves. Of course, the actual updating of the WordPress core files takes time. Oftentimes, doesn't take terribly long at all. It's usually just a click of a button, maybe a minute or 2 or 3 later, WordPress is updated and you're good to go. So that's the good news, is it doesn't tend to take very long. But now moving into plugins and themes, for plugins, you want to make sure to keep this as low of a number as possible. In fact, in general, the recommendation is not more than 5 plugins. If you're on shared or budget hosting, if you have more server space and more server resources, you can even do something, for example, if you're on like a virtual private server or a dedicated server, something like that, you can maybe do up to like 20 if you have more space. But here's the problem. Too many plugins can do things like slow your site down. So your customers are trying to get to your site, but it's loading, or it just takes that extra 1/10 of a second to load, anything like that. But also, if your site's slow, how much more time will this then take to implement the security measures that you need to do? It's that extra time that is now being put into it. As well, plugins up your risk of vulnerabilities. Outdated software is one of the leading causes of intrusion. So you need to make sure that these updates are done, as well as you need to make sure that you are not using outdated plugins. You need to make sure that all the plugins that are there are actually needed. And we'll get into that in just another minute. But for example, of a plugin that wasn't being used or was being used, but got deprecated, there was the user-related plugin that was deprecated just simply by WordPress. It was not being updated by the plugin author. There was an unauthenticated cross-site scripting bug that was found and was exploited. And I remember my team and we dealt with this. We had to take care of a number of sites that were maliciously redirecting, that weren't working properly, all this kind of thing. And it wasn't getting updated. So WordPress said, we're done here, closed it. And the plugin author actually advised to uninstall it entirely, because even though it was deactivated, it was still exploitable. Now, moving into themes a little bit. So you want to make sure that also your themes are updated. And here's the thing about themes, is you only want to keep themes that you're actively using. So if you like to switch back and forth, or if there's one in particular that you're using, make sure that you are only keeping that one, as well as like a base WordPress theme. So if something happens to your theme, it gets corrupted, a plugin update messes it up, you get infected, and the entire theme just gets completely messed up. Happens, unfortunately, a number of times that I've seen. It's not rare that a bad infection will completely overwrite theme files, and a restore is necessary for it. You want to make sure that you keep a backup theme, preferably something that's just like a normal, like 2020 or 2019, one of those base WordPress install themes that are there, because it's there. WordPress themselves will keep it updated, I believe, and so it should be consistently updated and will just simply work as a backup if you ever need it to. And again, updates, they can take time. This takes some time depending on how many themes you're keeping, so keep that in mind. For all of this, and one thing I want to touch on here, the reason that I'm talking so much about updates, about time to do updates, about all that kind of thing, is any of these things, themes, plugins, they qualify as outdated software. So even if the theme or plugin is not active, the software itself is still there and can be exploited, like the 2 ones I mentioned earlier. Oftentimes, WP File Manager was deactivated. Nobody needed it, but it was still sitting there. So themes and plugins, they need to be thought of as things that need maintenance, and most especially review. Malicious actors can, in fact, use these to get in. Think about it sort of like, well, for example, so they're like hardware, like a computer or a monitor or your old lawnmower or something like that. It's not just hardware that just sits there and takes up space. This is a lot more like the food in your fridge that can go bad and cause problems. It needs to be replaced and thrown out occasionally. So for example, bad food can be a vector by which you get food poisoning. By the same token, outdated plugins and themes are the vector by which sites can and will get infected. So if you don't think that you're ever going to go back to a theme or a plugin, deactivate it. Get rid of it. It's kind of like, I'm sorry, not get rid of it, but just simply deactivate it if you think you are going to go back to it. Because with that, it's kind of a lot more like putting the food for later in the freezer. Like you're not going to use it right now, but you're probably going to use it in the future, so you want to keep it for later. But if you are done with it entirely, don't just deactivate it, entirely delete it off your site, because you can always re-download most of these things for another time. And when you re-download them, it will be the latest version, so you don't have to worry about continuing to update it. Moving back to our overarching theme of time, figure that per theme or plugin, you're probably looking at about an average of anywhere between about 5 to 10 minutes per plugin or theme. I mean, I've seen themes or plugins get updated within like a minute or two, but on average, depending on the plugin or theme, you're looking at about 5 to 10 minutes. And again, if something breaks, you also need time to restore it and then figure out what broke it. So actually, and on that topic, we'll just go ahead and talk about backups and restores. So how much time does it take to even backup or restore your site? Now, this will depend on the size of the site. It can be anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes, depending on the size of your site. But this also depends on something we'll get into in just a minute. It depends on if your site is backed up somewhere on the same hosting account itself, or it can take more time to restore or backup if it's somewhere else. So one other thing to consider with your backups is how often are you taking backups and how much time will this take? So what some people will do is they'll take backups every so often. What they will do is they'll take a full website backup. So we're talking all the files and the entire database, just take a snapshot of it and store it wherever they're storing it. This can take some time. It can take a lot of time if, again, if you're taking your backups and putting them out of the hosting account. It can take a lot of time if your website is particularly large. These things can take a lot of time. So, excuse me. So another option is taking just simply partial backups. Maybe you're just taking a snapshot of your database. Maybe you're just taking a snapshot of your files. Maybe you have a new theme installed that you want to make sure that you have a backup of it should something happen. Maybe you just did a lot of content update. Maybe there's some brand new articles you put up. Maybe you put a new product up. All this kind of thing. Need to take a backup of it. So you just take a backup of maybe the database or just the files. Just a partial backup. And then there's the other option that people do is just taking backups of your updates. Say you did put up that new product. Say you did put out that new article, and you're just going to take a backup now, and that's all you need. So, but again, these things take time. Now, just a small update, not going to take that much time. A partial backup is going to take more time than just an update, but less time than a whole backup. And of course, a whole website backup, again, depending on the size of your site, can take extra and bigger time. And now moving into the question of where is this backup going to be? Because again, that will affect how long the backup's going to take and how long the restore is going to take. So are you backing up somewhere off of the hosting account? This can be something like backing it up to your local computer, backing up to a company that keeps backups, or a backup solution at maybe your hosting provider, that kind of thing. Now, keep in mind, where this is will also depend on the amount of time, because you need to be able to access the backup. You need to be able to access backup to be able to restore it or even to take the backup. So if it's being backed up to a local computer, whose computer is taking that backup? Will multiple people have access to that computer should the need arise? Are you going to have access? Are you just taking these backups? Where are these backups, and are they accessible? If it's being backed up to a backup company or with a backup solution, who has access to that? Will you have access should the need arise? Will your client have access should the need arise? Keep these things in mind. Now, for the pros and cons of taking an offsite backup, so basically a backup that's off of the hosting account, if it's not on the hosting account and the hosting account gets corrupted or deleted, the backup won't. It's not there. So then once you're able to get the hosting account restored, or if you just have to delete the whole site for whatever reason because it's just simply so infected, then you can just put a backup on there because it got neither deleted nor corrupted. However, con of this is that it can take longer to restore, and it's also less easily accessible, sort of like what I was talking about with the local computer who has access to the backup. It's less easily accessible, and it can take longer to restore because it has to be connected to the hosting account to do the restore. Now, the other option is to do an on-site backup, and this has its own pros and cons as well, but basically what it means is it will be somewhere on the hosting account itself. So for example, you can do a backup plugin. There are plenty of those out there that take just simply a snapshot of it, click a button, snapshot's taken. There are hosting control panels will generally have some kind of backup capability that the customer themselves can take. So cPanel absolutely has one, Plesk has one as well. And if you have something that's outside of one of those, you can always check with your hosting provider. That basically you can just click a button and usually it'll just take the snapshot. Again, this may take extra time depending on the size of your site, that kind of thing. But it's usually just one click backup and one click restore. So, but the pros and cons of this are, the pro is that it can be potentially a shorter time to restore because it's just all there. Everything's on the same thing. There's no movement from one computer to another. It's just there. Also, it's more easily accessible. So if you or several other people will generally have access to the hosting account itself, if anybody has access to the hosting account, they can gain access to that backup, and then you're good to go to restore it. However, by the same token, if it's on the same hosting account and the hosting account gets corrupted or deleted, the backup or backups might get corrupted or deleted as well. Now, on the topic of these backups getting corrupted, if the backup's corrupted, it could take longer to simply restore the whole thing. So something else to consider is that it may have to be manually restored. Maybe you're the one with the only good backup on your local computer, and you have to then restore the whole site. So that means FTPing the files or somehow getting the files onto the hosting account, restoring the database itself. And how much time is that going to take? Is it going to be a quick thing to just zip up the files and move them and zip up the database and restore it through phpMyAdmin? Is it more complicated? These are things that need to be taken into account. Time. So basically, the takeaways for all this is make a plan for your security now. Understand everything that goes into it, all the possibilities. Take those backups, do your updates, all your passwords, contact who you need to, and note everything that you're doing along the way so that you remember, okay, this had to happen. This person takes this amount of time to contact. I have to contact this person to be able to get access to this, that kind of thing. Put all this into your plan, implement it as soon as possible. You can start doing all these things today. Changing passwords, checking your updates, checking your admin users, everything like that, getting in contact with people, understanding who needs to be contacted for everything. As soon as possible, gather all this information and make a plan. And don't wait for a breach. Far too many people, far too many websites wait for their breach that's going to happen because you're on the internet. This is the nature of the beast. Far too many people wait until the breach happens to implement their security plan. And they may not even have a plan. They had their breach, they don't know what to do, and they're suddenly at a loss. Their website is down, their business is down, they're losing money, all because they didn't have a plan. So make sure you have a plan, make that plan, implement it as soon as possible, don't wait for a breach. And I want to thank everybody for coming. I hope that this is helpful, and I hope you enjoyed.
Well, thank you so much, Kara. That was a lot of information in a short amount of time, which is good for people to digest. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A side of the chat, and we'll go through them. I actually had a question, knowing that a lot of our audience is running agencies or they're freelancers. Let's say an agency doesn't offer hosting specifically, so all of their clients are hosted all over the internet at different places. Would putting these plans together be a strong service to offer right out of the gate for some of their clients, especially when you're looking at hosting being all over the place, or if all you're doing is maintenance? is that putting that plan together a strong product offering?
I would absolutely say so, because then that also provides customer confidence. You talk with them initially, or even put on your website, we make security plans with you. When something happens, we've got a plan for you. And you can absolutely offer that as a service, because then, like I said, customer confidence, they understand that you have their best interest in mind, so they're more willing to go with you. And then also that helps keep you accountable to make sure that you make that plan and that you have that. And then you also, then what I also recommend at that point is make a plan to make a plan. Figure out what all needs to be taken into account at that point.
Yeah, I've seen some clients, because I used to work in the agency world, that would come to the agencies I worked for, and they would have a plan in place and say, this is our plan and we want you to stick to this. But there's also clients that I've seen that don't even know they need a plan. And so being able to step in and say, hey, do you have this? If you don't, we'll sit down an hour of our time and help you create this, I definitely think is a strong way to start that relationship. Are there any tools or products that you're aware of that can help you implement some of these things, streamlining backups, things of that nature?
Yeah, there's various different plugins. They all have their pros and cons. Backup Buddy is one that's often used that I see. It can be a little clunky and not work nearly as well, but it is easy to use. So there is that side of it. So you have to figure out what's going to work best for you. Do you need ease of use? Do you need something else to work with, long and the short of it? But especially if you have a control panel, then I definitely recommend diving into that, seeing what the options are for a backup. GoDaddy, of course, offers backup solutions as well, which actually work very well. And there's a whole team behind it that are very competent and know really well what they're doing. So,
for sure. Yeah, I know I'm actually on the GoDaddy Pro team. So, being able to see just how all of that's in one place, being able to monitor the security, all of that's inside of GoDaddy Pro. Don't want to harp on that, though. That's not what we're here for. We're here to learn about security as a whole, but just know that that tool exists. And honestly, I think the biggest lesson for people to come out of this from is understanding that backups are important. It doesn't really matter how you're doing them or where you're doing them, it's that you're doing them. So definitely make sure that you have a backup solution. Are there any other things that you wanted to touch on? I'm not seeing any questions come through, which is fine. You can always, Kara provided her Twitter information, so you can always hit her up there as well if you think of something later. But is there anything that you want to close us out with?
Just make sure you have a plan, come up with it. It's very important. Just remember that if you're on the internet, which everybody is these days, a hack is going to happen. So just make sure you have an emergency plan in place.
Absolutely. And like I said, this is going to be a whole series on security. So next week we have another speaker speaking on security again. But we actually have a question. GoDaddy uploaded GoDaddy Pro Sites Worker. Why? I'm not sure I 100% understand the question, but if you're hosted on a GoDaddy managed WordPress plan, then I think it's preloaded. So if that's what you're talking about, then yes, it's preloaded on the site. GoDaddy Pro Sites Worker is GoDaddy Pro, the tool to manage your backups and security and all of that. So that's what that plugin does. So hopefully that helped. If it didn't, let me know. Yeah, so I think it just depends on what plan you're on. But I'll drop my information in the chat so that we can connect afterwards for sure. So yeah, so next week is also another one on security, and this will be posted on the same page where you registered. This video will be posted, so you'll be able to go back and reference it again. So if you missed anything or if you wanted to rewatch something, you feel free to be able to do that. Thank you for coming, and we will see you at our next GoDaddy Pro meetup.